The kettle had just started to whistle when my daughter-in-law walked through the front door without knocking. That was the first thing that struck me as wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not the kind of wrong that makes you reach for the phone or raise your voice. Just the small, quiet wrong of a boundary crossed so casually that she didn't even notice she was crossing it. Margaret had a key because we'd given her one 3 Christmases ago, when she and my son Trevor had moved into the house 2 streets over. The key was for emergencies. She used it like a pass card. "Good morning, Gerald," she said, already moving toward the coffee maker, already opening the cupboard where we kept the mugs, the good ones, the ones my wife Elaine had picked out years ago at a market in Prince Edward County. "Trevor needs you to sign some papers today." I told him I'd bring them by. I was 63 years old that morning. I had spent 31 of those years building Hartwell Property Holdings from a single rental unit in Barrie, Ontario, into a portfolio that my accountant described, with quiet satisfaction, as substantial. I had raised 2 children, buried a wife, survived a bypass surgery, and learned, slowly and with considerable effort, not to fill every silence with words. I poured my tea. I waited. "What kind of papers?" I asked. She set a mug down in front of me. She'd made herself coffee without asking, and smiled the smile I had come to recognize over 7 years of Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings. It was a smile that arrived slightly before the words, like a door held open just wide enough to usher you into a room before you realized what room it was. "Just some administrative stuff," she said. "Trevor said you'd know what it was about." I did not know what it was about, but I had learned, in those 7 years, that saying so directly gave Margaret an advantage she did not need more of. My son, Trevor, was 41 years old. He was a good man in the way that some men are good genuinely, quietly, without performance. He worked as a site supervisor for a mid-sized construction company out of Aurelia. He coached minor hockey on Tuesday nights. He called me every Sunday morning between 8 and 9, without fail, even on the mornings when he had nothing particular to say. When Elaine had passed 4 years ago, a stroke, sudden, the way the doctors always describe strokes as though suddenness is somehow a comfort, Trevor had driven 3 hours in a February snowstorm to sit with me in the kitchen and not say very much at all. That was the kind of man he was. Margaret was a different kind of person. I don't say that with bitterness. I have tried, in the years since everything happened, to describe her accurately rather than uncharitably. She was intelligent. She was organized in the way that certain people are organized, not out of discipline, but out of a constant, humming awareness of what she wanted and what stood between her and having it. She had worked in real estate before she and Trevor married, which was how we'd met. Actually, she'd been the agent on a small commercial property I'd acquired near Collingwood. She knew the language of property and title and transfer. At the time, I'd found that impressive. The papers she brought that morning were folded inside a manila envelope with my name written on the front in her handwriting. "Trevor's already signed," she said. "It's just a refinancing thing. For the Penetanguishene property." The Penetanguishene property was a 12-unit residential building I'd purchased in 2009. It was the crown jewel of the portfolio, if a 40-year-old walk-up building in a mid-sized Georgian Bay town can be described as a crown jewel. It was paid off. It generated reliable income. It was, according to the terms of my estate plan, designated to pass to Trevor and my daughter Carolyn in equal shares upon my death. I looked at the papers. I did not sign them. "I'll have my lawyer look at these," I said. The smile didn't waver, but something behind it did. A very slight recalibration, like a thermostat clicking on. "Of course," she said. "No rush. There is always a rush, with Margaret." That was something I'd come to understand. The appearance of patience was just another instrument. I should explain about my health, because it matters to what comes next. 8 months before that morning, I had been diagnosed with a condition called atrial fibrillation, an irregular heartbeat that, managed properly, is not immediately dangerous, but that required medication adjustments, regular monitoring, and a period of reduced activity that my cardiologist in Toronto described as taking things easy, a phrase I had always found quietly insulting. I had told Trevor. I had told Carolyn. I had, at Trevor's urging, told Margaret, because she and Trevor shared a household and a life, and it seemed dishonest not to. What I had not anticipated was how Margaret would file that information away. In the months that followed my diagnosis, she began stopping by more frequently, bringing meals, nothing dramatic, just containers of soup or a casserole left on the front step with a note. asking, with what seemed like genuine concern, whether I was keeping up with the property management, whether the stress of the portfolio was too much right now, whether I'd considered lightening the load a little. She mentioned, twice, that she knew a property management company in Barrie that handled estates like mine very efficiently. I am not a suspicious man by nature. I want to be clear about that. I had built a career on handshakes, and my word, and the belief that most people, most of the time, are trying to do right by the people around them. But I am also not a fool, and there is a particular feeling, I don't have a precise word for it, that arrives when someone's kindness begins to have a shape to it, when the edges of their concern are just a little too neat. I began paying closer attention. The first thing I noticed was the calls with Trevor. Our Sunday conversations, which had always been easy and unhurried, began to include a new category of subject: my health, my capacity, my plans for the portfolio. Trevor would ask these questions carefully, as though he'd rehearsed the phrasing, and when I deflected, which I did, gently, there would be a pause that felt like someone listening in the next room. Once, in late October, he said, "Margaret thinks it might make sense to consolidate some of the holdings, simplify things. She says it would be easier for Carolyn and me when the time comes." "When the time comes?" I repeated. "Dad, I just mean she knows property. She's trying to help." "I know she is," I said, and I left it there. The second thing I noticed was a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. I had driven to Trevor's house on a Tuesday evening, one of the hockey nights, which meant Trevor wouldn't be back until after 8 to drop off a file I'd been meaning to give him for weeks. I knocked. No answer. I could hear Margaret on the phone inside, her voice carrying through the aluminum storm door with that particular clarity of someone who believes themselves to be alone. "Doesn't matter what the lawyer says, Roger. If Gerald signs the management transfer, it gives us operational control, and then it's just a matter of time before." I stepped back from the door. I walked back to my car. I sat in the driveway for a long moment, watching the light in the front window. Roger was Margaret's brother. He had a small property development company in Vaughan that had, from what I understood, experienced some financial difficulty in the previous 2 years. I drove home. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table where Elaine and I had eaten 10,000 meals, and I thought about what kind of man I wanted to be in response to what I had just heard. Not what kind of man I was capable of being anger, and I had a long acquaintance, and I knew exactly what I was capable of when provoked, but what kind of man I wanted to be. I decided I wanted to be the kind of man who was certain before he acted. The next morning, I called my lawyer. David Chow had handled my legal affairs for 22 years. He was methodical and careful, and he had the quality I value most in a professional advisor, which is that he told me things I didn't want to hear without apologizing for them. I told him about the papers Margaret had brought. I told him about the phone call. I described, as precisely as I could, the pattern of the previous several months. There was a silence on the line. "Don't sign anything," he said. "Don't discuss the portfolio with Margaret directly. And Gerald, do you have access to all your own account documentation? Digital access?" I did. I checked that week. Everything was in order. Nothing had been moved. But David flagged something I hadn't considered. A power of attorney document I had signed 2 years earlier, in the immediate aftermath of my diagnosis, at the urging of, and I had not fully registered this at the time, Margaret, who had recommended the notary and driven me to the appointment. The document named Trevor as my attorney for property, with a provision that in the event Trevor was unavailable or incapacitated, that authority passed to his spouse. "It's a standard form," David said, "but in the wrong hands, with the right sequence of events, it could be used to what? To challenge your decision-making capacity, to argue you needed someone to act on your behalf. If they could establish, medically or otherwise, that you weren't able to manage your own affairs." I sat with that for a long moment. "Revoke it," I said. "Already drafting the paperwork," David said. It was around this time that my daughter Carolyn came home. Carolyn was 38, and she had been living in Vancouver for the past 6 years, working as a nurse practitioner in a community health clinic in East Van. She was sharp and practical, and she had her mother's way of cutting directly to the center of a thing without cruelty. She called me every few days, not out of obligation, I think, but because she genuinely wanted to know how I was doing, and had enough clinical training to sense when fine did not mean fine. I had not told her about any of this. I hadn't wanted to alarm her, and I hadn't been certain enough of my own read on the situation to speak it out loud to my daughter. But in November she called on a Wednesday, which was unusual, and said she'd booked a flight home for the following weekend, and something in her voice told me she'd already worked something out on her own. She arrived on a Friday evening. I picked her up at Pearson and we drove back through the gray November dark, and somewhere on the 400 north of Barrie, she said, without preamble, "Dad, has Margaret been asking you to sign things?" I looked at the road, Trevor told her. She said he thought he was telling her something normal. He didn't understand what she was planning to do with it. He still doesn't, I said. No, Carolyn said. He doesn't. We drove in silence for a while. She called me, Carolyn said eventually, last month. Said she was concerned about your health. Said she thought it might be worth having a family conversation about your ability to manage the estate. She suggested, and Dad, I want you to hear this clearly, she suggested that a capacity assessment might be in your best interests. A capacity assessment, the clinical term for a formal evaluation of whether a person is mentally capable of making their own decisions. I am 63 years old. I have an irregular heartbeat that is controlled with medication. My mind is as clear as it has ever been, which is to say, very clear. I said nothing for the rest of the drive, but something settled in me, the way things settle when you finally have a complete picture of what you're looking at. What happened next took 3 months, and I want to describe it carefully, because the details matter. David had, in those weeks, quietly moved to revoke the power of attorney and update my estate documents with a new attorney designation, Carolyn, directly, with no spousal provision. He had also flagged, in reviewing the Penetanguishene property files, that 2 documents had been filed with the Land Registry Office, without my knowledge. Not transfers, not yet, but preliminary liens from a numbered company registered in Ontario. The numbered company, when traced, resolved to Roger. Margaret had not acted alone, and she had not been idle. What she had not known, what no one in my family knew except Carolyn, who had helped me install it after my diagnosis, was that I had a home security system with interior cameras covering the main living areas and my home office. Carolyn had suggested it. Just in case you have a fall, Dad. Just so someone can check on you. I had agreed, because it seemed sensible. The cameras were small. They were not hidden. I hadn't installed them to surveil anyone, but they were not obvious either, and in the ordinary course of a visit, no one thought to look for them. The cameras had recorded Margaret, on 4 separate occasions, over 6 weeks, accessing my home office while I was at medical appointments. I had given her a key for emergencies, and she had used it, as she used everything, precisely and without hesitation. The recordings showed her photographing documents on my desk, reviewing folders in my filing cabinet. On one occasion, sitting at my desk chair and spending 17 minutes at my computer, though the camera angle did not capture the screen. David reviewed the footage with a forensic IT specialist he brought in. The specialist confirmed that during that 17-minute session, someone had accessed my online banking portal using a secondary device, a phone, and had attempted, unsuccessfully, to add a new e-transfer recipient. The banking system had flagged the attempt and sent a verification code to my cell phone, which I had received while sitting in a waiting room in Barrie and assumed was a system glitch. It was not a system glitch. I called Trevor on a Sunday morning. Not between 8 and 9 earlier, at 7, before Margaret would be up. He answered on the second ring, still half asleep, and I asked him to come over alone. He arrived 45 minutes later in his work jacket, holding a travel mug, looking like the boy he'd been 20 years ago when I used to wake him early for fishing. I let him in and I sat him down at the kitchen table, and I put everything in front of him. The documents, the land registry findings, David's legal summary, and the recordings. I want to tell you that Trevor's face, when he understood what he was seeing, was simply angry. That would have been easier. What it actually was something I don't have a clean word for, a kind of slow collapse, like watching a structure you trusted give way not all at once, but gradually, each support failing in sequence. He watched the recordings twice without speaking. He read the legal documents. He set them down, and he looked at the wall above my head, and he stayed like that for a long time. I didn't know, he said. I know you didn't, I said. I thought she was looking out for you. She told me she was looking out for you. I know. He pressed his hands flat on the table. Dad, I'm so sorry. Here is what I want to say about that moment, because it is the part of this story that matters most to me. I believed him. Not because I needed to, not because it was convenient, but because I knew my son. I had known him for 41 years, and I knew the particular texture of his remorse, and this was real. He had been used as a conduit. He had carried concerns back and forth that he understood to be genuine expressions of care, and he had not looked closely enough at the architecture of them. That was a failure of a kind. But it was not the same failure as his wife's. I need you to do something hard, I told him. He nodded. I need you to go home and act normal. I need you to do that for about 2 more weeks. He looked at me. David needs time to complete the filings, I said. And there are a few things that need to happen in a specific order. If Margaret knows, we know if anything changes, she may move faster than we can. Trevor set down his coffee mug. He straightened in his chair, and for a moment he looked exactly like his mother, that particular quality of stillness Elaine had when she'd made up her mind about something. Okay, he said. 2 weeks. What happened at the end of those 2 weeks was not dramatic, at least not in the way that word usually implies. There was no confrontation in a driveway. There was no shouting. David sent a letter, registered mail, to Margaret and to Roger's numbered company simultaneously, outlining what had been discovered, what documentation existed, and what remedies were being pursued. The liens were challenged and removed. A separate letter went to the Law Society regarding the notary who had overseen the original power of attorney, given the questions around the circumstances of that signing. Margaret called me the morning the letter arrived. I let it go to voicemail. She left a message that lasted 4 minutes and covered a remarkable amount of ground: indignation, injury, reinterpretation of every event I've described here as an act of concern rather than manipulation. I listened to it once. I kept the recording. Trevor retained his own lawyer that same week. His marriage to Margaret was over not because I asked it to be. I want to be clear about that. Trevor had made his own calculation, looking at his own life, and had arrived at his own conclusion. That winter was quiet, in the way that some winters are not empty, but settled. Carolyn stayed through the holidays, longer than she'd planned. We cooked Elaine's recipes and argued about hockey and drove out to the Penetanguishene property one clear January afternoon and walked the perimeter of it in the cold, breathing out clouds of steam. "You okay?" she asked. "I'm okay," I said, and I meant it in the plain, undefended way that I hadn't meant anything in quite a while. Trevor came for Christmas. He was quieter than usual, which made sense. We played cards and watched the game and did not talk about Margaret, because there was nothing about Margaret that needed to be said between us that hadn't already been said. At the end of the night, he stood at the door pulling on his coat and he said, "I should have seen it, Dad. I'm sorry I didn't see it." "You trusted her," I said. "That's not a character flaw. It was naive." "Yes," I said, "but naive and dishonest aren't the same thing. Don't let her make you distrust the first one because of the second." He thought about that for a moment. Then he nodded and went out into the cold. I have thought a lot, in the months since all of this, about what I would say to someone in the position I was in, or in the position Trevor was in, or even in the position of a person who loves someone and fails to see what that person is doing until too late. The first thing is this: know what you have, not in the sense of pride or ownership, but in the sense of clarity. Know your documents. Know what is signed and what isn't, what is registered and what isn't, who has authority over what. I had built something over 3 decades, and I had let the administrative layer of it grow soft, because I was tired, and because I trusted people I should have verified. Clarity is not suspicion. It is just attention. The second thing is, the people who want to help you are usually the ones who tell you what you don't want to hear. Margaret's concern for me was always delivered in a way that made me feel like a problem to be managed. Carolyn's concern came in the form of questions she was willing to hear the actual answer to. The difference between those two things is not subtle once you are paying attention. The third thing, and this is the one I think about most, is about loyalty. I was loyal to a picture of my family that wasn't entirely accurate. I held that picture in place even when small details didn't fit it, because the picture was comfortable and the alternative was painful. I think this is very human. I also think it is a thing worth noticing in yourself, because the longer you hold a picture that isn't accurate, the more expensive the correction becomes. The Penetanguishene building still stands. Carolyn and Trevor will inherit it equally, one day. Not soon. I hope I have an irregular heartbeat, and I take my medication, and I see my cardiologist 4 times a year, and I intend to be an inconvenience to everyone who loves me for a considerable time yet. I walk in the mornings along the bay, in whatever weather the Georgian Bay Area sees fit to send, and I think about Elaine, who would have spotted all of this approximately 4 months before I did, and I think about the kind of man I tried to be through it, and whether I managed it. Some mornings I think I did. Some mornings I think I was too slow, too accommodating, too willing to wait for certainty before I acted on what I already knew. I have not resolved that. I am not sure it is the kind of thing you resolve. I think you just carry it forward and try to be a little more awake the next time. The kettle still whistles at the same time every morning. I pour my tea. I do not let people into my home without knocking anymore. That is a small thing. But small things, I have come to believe, are where most of the important decisions actually live.